November 1st, 1945. It has been almost 6 months since the surrender of Nazi Germany in Europe. However, the Second World War rages as there is one last member of the Axis powers continuing the war, the Empire of Japan. Every attempt to force the Japanese government to surrender has failed, and the Manhattan Project is still trying to successfully create an atomic bomb. With all attempts having failed, the American High Command approves Operation Downfall, the invasion of Japan. The scene opens with a massive fleet of American warships firing their giant guns onto the Japanese island of Kyushu. For context, Kyushu is located here. It's the southernmost point of mainland Japan. Anyway, this naval barrage has been going on for 10 days, and Kyushu has been reduced to an empty wasteland with a majority of the green on the coast of the island turned to black. As the barrage continues, American landing ships prepare smaller landing craft for the invasion. The scene cuts to a group of U.S. Marines, along with their commander, Sergeant Davis, boarding a landing craft, and once everyone is accounted for, the boat begins heading off. As this boat travels through the waves, we see more landing craft. And then even more. This wave of landing craft seems to go on for miles, but it's not just landing craft. There's also seemingly countless LVTs, amphibious Sherman tanks, and specially designed landing craft carrying American Pershing tanks. Davis and his men look up into the sky to see large numbers of F-4U Corsair fighters and brand new AD-1 Skyraider attack aircraft armed with rockets and bombs soaring towards the island. Soldiers from everywhere are taking part in this invasion. Marines that fought through the Pacific, the Navy, Air Force, and even Army personnel who fought in Europe have been brought here too. Over 500,000 American troops are descending on Kyushu in an invasion that dwarfs D-Day. As the boats get closer and closer to the beach, Davis tells his men to prepare themselves and to charge up the beach the moment the boat's door drops. Davis and several of his men previously fought on Iwo Jima and Okinawa and therefore have knowledge of Japanese tactics, especially with their use of guerrilla warfare. The first to land are the Sherman and Pershing tanks that immediately begin pushing forward, and up next are the troops. But as the Marines land, some of the boats explode. Hiding beneath the waves are Japanese suicide divers who are armed with mines. After this, the guns and cannons begin opening up on the American forces. Marines immediately begin getting cut down, and the remaining take cover behind the tanks and continue pushing forward. As the LVTs, Shermans, and Pershings continue to push inland and provide fire support, Davis and his Marines begin firing back at the Japanese pillboxes. Once close enough, Marines armed with flamethrowers approach the pillboxes and set them ablaze. As the Japanese soldiers run out of the pillbox burning, the Marines and tanks proceed to gun them down. After other pillboxes and bunkers are cleared out, the American forces finally move off of the beach and continue pushing inland. Davis and his men continue the march with tank support, but soon they hear aircraft from above, and immediately recognize them as Japanese ones. The Americans take cover, thinking the Japanese planes are going to crash into them, but they fly past, and Davis realizes they are attempting to kamikaze into the American fleet off the coast of the island. However, under the orders of command, the Marines keep pushing forward. After getting a certain distance, American forces halt to regroup and discuss their next objective, while more reinforcements arrive from the beach. Part of the plan is to capture a large mountain, believed to be the location of a large system of underground Japanese tunnels. Before the Americans can continue their advance, Davis and his men hear a man scream, "Tenno-heika! Banzai!" and turn to see a large squad of Japanese soldiers charging at them. The Americans begin firing at them, but the Japanese just keep coming, and eventually they reach the American lines. Imperial soldiers attack the Marines with katanas and bayonets, and a few of them suicide bomb the tanks, resulting in them blowing up. As the Americans pull back, one of Davis's men radios for air support and is informed that some Skyraiders are on the way. Together, Davis and his men regroup, and the Marines hold back the Japanese troops until the planes arrive and bomb the Japanese forces. During the bombing, one of the bombs causes a shockwave that throws back Davis just before he gets stabbed by a Japanese officer with a katana. After the planes pass, Davis gets back up to see that same officer on his knees, and in a fit of rage, grabs the katana and stabs the officer in the back. Davis then moves back to help his men back to their feet, and they wait for reinforcements to arrive. Once they take back the dead and fresh numbers of soldiers and tanks arrive, the American forces continue to push towards their objective. Along the way, the Marines face opposition from Japanese forces consisting of snipers and machine gunners, but the Marines manage to defeat them and eventually reach the base of the mountain. The Marines arrive and are immediately greeted by massive amounts of machine gun and cannon fire. The Marines once again take cover behind the tanks and slowly make their way to the Japanese troops. The tanks fire their cannons into the Japanese positions, and some of the Shermans, armed with flamethrowers, torch into the cave openings in the mountain. Once close enough, the Marines begin climbing the mountain. However, as the Marines get closer to the top, the Japanese resistance gets more fanatical, and the Americans suffer many casualties and even lose some of the tanks. David and his men reach the peak of the mountain, but most of the Japanese soldiers are still inside the mountain. They realize they do not have enough forces to flush the Japanese out, so they once again call for air support. As the planes are on their way, all the Marines in the area are ordered to put on gas masks that were issued to them. A squadron of Sky Raiders and Corsairs fly in and drop chemical bombs onto the Japanese positions. The Marines watch as the Japanese soldiers try to escape as the gas fills up their tunnels and they struggle to breathe. Although a cruel weapon to use, it proves to be an effective way to flush out the Japanese, and more Marines successfully climb to the peak of the mountain. Eventually, Davis and his men bring an American flag and raise it at the peak, similar to the flag raising on Iwo Jima. The Marines look out to the coast and see the massive naval fleet, along with a few sinking ships and countless more reinforcements heading to the island. The Marines take a short break to rest and regroup while they receive orders on their next objective. A large portion of the Marines are ordered to push farther inland and are tasked with capturing a third of Kyushu. Davis and another large group of Marines get ordered to help support the assault on the nearby city of Kagoshima. 1 hour later, Davis and the large assault force arrives outside the city and push their way inside. The Marines begin fighting their way through the streets, and the fighting gets harder and harder the deeper they get in the city. The Japanese resistance gets stronger and stronger, and this leads to heavy casualties on both sides. Eventually, Davis's force enters a large courtyard in the city and are greeted by a heavily defended building, and several Marines are cut down by the gunfire. The Pershings drive up and aim their guns at the building, but before they can fire, Japanese soldiers charge at them with tools called lunge mines, and the resulting explosion kills both them and destroys the tanks. With the tanks destroyed and several Marines killed, Davis and the remaining Marines take cover as the gunfire continues. One of the Marines tells Davis that a large amount of reinforcements are coming, and all they have to do is hold out until they arrive, so that's what they do. During the ensuing fight, several Japanese troops are killed, but there just seems to be always someone taking their place, and the situation looks hopeless. The heavy machine guns inside the building suddenly stop, and one of the soldiers inside is heard screaming, "Teki Sensha!" And then a large portion of the building is blown up. Davis looks back to see the reinforcements have arrived, and they are led by a new tank. Not a Sherman or a Pershing, but something bigger. Leading the assault is the brand new American T-29 heavy tank. This specific one is an E3 model, which has modifications making it better at aiming and range-finding targets. The T-29 moves forward and is followed by the large formation of troops, and Davis joins them. Together, Davis and the massive Marine force continue fighting the remaining resistance in the city. During the fight, the T-29 shows off its abilities to deliver heavy firepower with its 105mm gun, and its ability to take punishment as all the cannons fired at it simply bounce off. By the end of the day, the last Japanese resistance has been defeated, and the stars and stripes begin waving over Kagoshima. Although this sounds great for the Americans, it's worth mentioning that this invasion hasn't been easy. By now, the casualties inflicted upon the Americans are unknown, but likely comparable to the total losses suffered on Okinawa. American deaths are likely around 8,000 to 12,000, while Japanese deaths are at least 4 times that. After the capture of the city, several groups of the invasion force, including the one the T-29 belongs to, are ordered to travel out and join the main Marine force, which is going to capture 1/3 of Kyushu, while Davis and the remaining Marines stay to occupy the city. After a few days, American troops in Kagoshima have brought somewhat stability to the city. Some Japanese citizens tried to fight back, but resistance was quickly suppressed, and most fled the city after being fed false propaganda saying the Americans were going to slaughter the population, while those who stayed surrendered and obviously weren't killed like they thought they were. Davis and his remaining Marines wait for the next orders to be given, while a nearby radio operator is trying to contact a group of scouts who are part of the force meant to capture 1/3 of Kyushu, but gets no response from them. The scene then cuts to the radio used by the scouts that suddenly gets run over by a tank, and then the camera pans out to reveal the scout team lying dead. As the scene pans out further, we see a force of seemingly thousands of Japanese soldiers marching toward the American lines that are positioned at their given points of Kyushu. This force is meant to counterattack the Americans and force them back to the sea. And with no warning, the Americans do not know they are coming.